So we'll come back to a variance analysis question, but in terms of some of the tools, I'm not going to worry too much about this. It's going to be easier to just see practically. But what I do want to hit is they call this flexible budget variance analysis. This is going to be easier. There you can see there's three types: volume, price, or rate, or quantity. And a lot of getting this straight just has to do with figuring out the clear definition in your own head first of what each one of these is: the volume, quantity, and the price. And I'll give you hospital examples because it's easy. Volume is easy. That's the number of patients. So you could think of that as volume or output. I'll just say O right there. And your quantity, days per person, patient. So that's kind of like an input, like how many days do you put on each patient, or how many nurses or nurse hours are spent on each patient, things like that. And since we already just mentioned inputs, specifically how many inputs are used per patient, per that output, how many units of input used per output, we'll also have to know the price per unit of input. So in this case, if we were looking at number of patients, this might be nurse hours, I'm not a good speller, hours, and this might be the wage per hour right there. Now these formulas, once you have this straight, the formulas down here are easy to do. You just kind of follow them right away. And I'll give you an example right out of the assignment in one moment. Now the textbook has this assignment or this example, and it's worth walking through. And I'll let you walk through this one. And I'll end with these words of caution, at least as far as the slides go, but then I'll switch back over to the assignment. One of the most obvious things is the way that you're doing variance analysis is arbitrary, like what you're calling here. Remember, there were three different types. There's volume variance, quantity variance, price variance. The order that you do things, and like if you look at things where the first one here, budgeted, and then we allow volume to change. So only volume changed. And remember, from above, that volume was, think of that as more or less your output. So if we just look at variance based on how much of the cost variance was because we produced more or less, in other words, had more or less patients, then we allow the volume to change while we arbitrarily keep the inputs, in other words, like the nursing effort per patient and the salary per nurse hour, if we keep those fixed. So what I was getting at in the last slide was the choice of which thing to keep fixed and variable in which order is arbitrary. But this is how it's commonly done, so that's how we'll run the formulas. Speaking of running the formulas, let's look now at one of the more complex questions in this assignment, which was right there. You can see that question. And again, I think I'm just paraphrasing, and I'm even going to leave the setup here for you. Now, you don't have to start with the Excel worksheet, but if you want, you can. Now, the numbers in green here are the numbers that you were given in the case. And then I looked at things a few different ways. We were told total number of hours, and that would be, I think that's more or less nurse hours. We were told their initial expected rate. We weren't actually told their new rate, but we were told that they wound up working 1,200 hours for a total cost of that. So, and you can see right there, there's a simple formula that computes the new rate or the actual rate. And you can see here that we computed there's a formula right there. You can see that we computed the hours per patient treated simply by dividing the number of hours right there by the number of patients. So you can see it's about half an hour per patient. That was our budget, at least. And you can see we're actually a little bit more efficient than we thought because it took us a little bit less time. Now, as I said earlier, if you define what among all these numbers is your price, your quantity, and your volume, once you get those definitions straight, the formulas just kind of give you the answers passively. So in this case, your rate per hour that's our price. Remember, that's more or less your price per input, and in this case, we're thinking of nursing hours as our input. So that the price per unit of input is right there. Our volume, remember volume was kind of like our output. One of the tricky ways to remember the output, that volume is output, is to recognize that there's an O in output and there's an O in volume. And then lastly, our quantity, which was how much of our input per unit of output. In other words, our efficiency, how many nursing hours was going into producing, quote unquote, producing each one of these patient outputs. Now, for each of these three things, we're going to compute a change. And we're going to use some common sense math, quote unquote, to make it so that a positive number is increasing our costs and a negative is decreasing. So in this case, if our price goes up, it should be positive, and indeed it did go up, so it would be there minus there. And you can see it goes up $1.67. Let's look at quantity, and in this case we want to do it this way, there minus there. We should get a negative number, which makes sense, because if we're more efficient, that will bring down our costs. Greater efficiency means we're doing more with less, so it brings down our costs. And then our volume clearly goes up from 2,000 to 600. From the textbook, and I put them over here for your convenience so you can see whether we're doing actuals and so forth, and you can see, so volume variance, going back to what the textbook said, volume variance is going to be the volume change times the budgeted quantity and the budgeted budgeted price. So let's just start filling in the blanks. We want the change in volume, so we'll use, there's our change in volume right there, but we wanted our budgeted quantity, so we're using this budgeted column right here. Our budgeted quantity, which was, there's the quantity right there, and we wanted there our budgeted price, which again is right there. Now that formula is already working for you, but you can see that if we just multiply out all three numbers there, 1 times that one times that one, we get the volume variance of 1,200. Now you've got the formula and the setup up here already, so you can work on the other two on your own. But if you're thinking about it this way, you can kind of think the first part, the volume variance, it basically assumes that only the volume changed and everything else, your quantity, in other words, your input efficiency, your nurse hours per unit, and your price per nurse, those are the same, so it's just the volume. So how much of your total change in costs is going to be due just to the change in the volume or the output. And then, to kind of help you understand the logic, in the second one, notice that it goes from volume change to actual volume. So assuming, up the first time, we assumed the volume was the only thing changing. Having assumed that the volume changed, now we use the actual volume, and we just go down the line. Now let's look at, assuming the volume changed, what was the change in quantity? Again, that would be nurse hours per unit, if the nurse rate didn't change right there. So you can see we're just kind of tripping, letting one thing change at a time. Volume, then quantity, then price. Now this question kind of goes through the rigid formulas that they recommend in textbooks. The next one was actually kind of more of an opportunity for you to kind of interpret things. In this case, there was a doctor, and in August, they have two types of patients, X patients and Y patients. And you can see we're given certain information right there. The green is for given. They did 7 patients of type X, 11 Y. There was the costs per unit. And they claimed that they were doing such an efficient job now, they were doing a more efficient job in September, so they would do certain favors from the hospital. So the question is, are they really helping? Now, there's a lot of perspectives you can take on this. Now, to me, the most practical, and one of the ones that insurance companies use all the time, is to apply, in the case of quality measures, peer average performance standards against your mix of patients. So let's assume that right here, just assuming that the doctor performed here, you can see it right there, August rates, the 7 and the 11, but at the September changes. And this is the amount. You can see each formula right there. That's just the change from one month to another. And 700 just means that your X cases were $700 more. So just multiplying those out. 700 times 7, there and there. And you can see the total, just adding those up, is there. Now what that 1600 means is that August, right there, would have been $1,600 more if they had done that with the same costs per unit as in September. Now we can also turn it on its head and just change the case mix at September rates. So if we looked at the August case mix at September rates, you can see the numbers come down right there. And we do the multiplications again. Now we copy that down. So on the one hand here, it sounds like the doctor wasn't making a good case if we look at these numbers. If we look at this number, it suddenly looks like the doctor might be helping us out. But one of the more practical ways to do this is just to look at the totals. So let's compute those right there. Use that same formula there, do a total there, and use the same formula there. So we can see it went from 129 to 127. Maybe the doctor has a point, but let's say you did September, those volumes at the costs per unit here. What would your total costs be? And we're just going to lift these formulas right now. There we go. So total cost would be 124. Compare that 124 to the actual 127, and the doctor's argument that they're doing a super great job for us starts to look more suspect, because you can see right there, they cost us 127, but if they were working just as efficiently this month, September, as they did last month in August, then it would have cost us only 124. The reason I like this perspective, like I said, is this is the perspective when insurance companies are doing report cards, they tend often to use standards, either your own past performance or that of your peers, and they apply that to your own case mix to see whether you're doing quite literally better or worse than your peers. So that's a few clues on the assignment